name is Renee Reiner. I, with my partner and husband Mike DeSanto, own Phoenix Books, and we are delighted to see you all here tonight. We are very, very excited. We partner with RETN Channel 16 to bring these shows to you on TV later after the fact, but you all are here live to help me welcome Jody Williams, the Nobel Peace Prize winner from 1997. We are very excited to have her here with us this evening, and it will be a very lively and engaging presentation. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Jody Williams.
The first thing I noticed was the mimeograph ink on the cheap paper was already staining my skin. You guys don't know what that is. What mimeograph ink? I was all pink over me. I was about to curse it rather foully when the 4 words on the cover came into focus. El Salvador, another Vietnam, with a question mark. I couldn't imagine a link between Vietnam and a tiny country in Central America that most couldn't find on a map. When I finally sat down to read the fateful little brochure, the information it outlined in spare bullet points described how my tax dollars were being used to support a war few of us knew about. I was feeling frustrated not only with my life at that moment, but I was also feeling powerless in the face of U.S. interventionist foreign policy, especially after the election of Ronald Reagan. However, instead of giving in to those feelings and doing nothing, I decided to go to the meeting about the war in El Salvador that the pamphlet announced for the coming week. The night of the meeting about Salvador arrived, and I went very, very early. It's a trait I carried over from grade school. As a child, I'd arrive so early in the morning that the doors weren't even unlocked because I was afraid of getting a tardy mark on my report card. I wasn't in grade school anymore, but I still didn't want to be late. I went down the stairs into the church's basement and could see a handful of people seated randomly on folding chairs arranged around an empty spot for the speaker. I sat near the exit. If the meeting turned out to be horrible, I could slink out more easily. That's why I gave you permission. I could slink out more easily. I wasn't particularly comfortable, but I waited. And by the time the presentation began, the audience numbered about a dozen, including myself. I imagine I was hoping to see a Salvadoran version of Ernesto Che Guevara. The man who spoke was not a super hot revolutionary in olive drab, wearing a dashing beret. Mario Velasquez was an attractive sophisticate in a 3-piece pinstripe suit. Pardon, Che. However, he was charismatic and spoke with a passion and clarity that might well have rivaled that of the famous revolutionary. Mario didn't simply spew out facts and figures about U.S. involvement in his country. He wove that information through a personal telling of how attempts at building democracy in El Salvador had been crushed. And it was more than that. Mario was the son, grandson, and great-grandson of men who become officers in the right-wing military. They helped keep the cabal of rich families in power at the expense of the vast majority of the crushingly poor and illiterate population. Mario was meant to follow in their footsteps. Instead, he joined the opposition. He never saw his father again after that. Listening to Mario that night rekindled the anger and confusion I'd felt about the U.S. during the war in Vietnam. How could this country continue to talk about democracy and self-determination while at the same time supporting dictators and militaries that stopped attempts at democratic change in their countries? But dismay does not accomplish a thing. Anger is not a strategy for change. The only thing that might help would be to do something to make it different. And when a sign-up sheet for volunteers was passed around at the end of the meeting, I added my name. I was actually born in Rutland because Pulteney has no hospital. We moved to the really megalopolis of Brattleboro. It was almost 10 times the size of Pulteney because my oldest brother Steve, was born deaf. And he was able to go to the school and live at home. So we moved to Brattleboro. My brother has had a difficult life and has had a huge impact in my family. In adolescence, he developed violent paranoid schizophrenia. So you can imagine a deaf paranoid schizophrenic. It's quite amazing. And he shaped my family in many ways, as you can imagine. He was violent toward my mother quite frequently, angry at her because the four others could hear and why couldn't he? I tried to defend her and slapped him hard across the face, and he slapped me right back, almost knocking me out. And the coup de grace was, however, when he picked up a butcher knife and kind of chased my mom and I out into the street. He never took his violence out publicly, though. He was not a dumb, he is not a dumb fellow. But one thing about my family is that Steve has lived with my parents, although my father died in 2004, his entire life, except for 2 times when he had to be institutionalized. The first being after that series of extreme violence where we really thought he'd either kill mom or himself. So he was in Waterbury. I doubt it still exists. No. Let's throw him in the street, right?
No, it got flooded.
So it's just been closed down.
He was in Waterbury for a year. They did nothing for him. They had no signed interpretation. How could a shrink talk to a deaf person if you didn't have an interpreter? So he essentially sat there for a year.
What year was that?
I was a sophomore at the University of Vermont. I think it was 70. No. I went 68, 69. I think it was 69, 70. I'm not quite positive, but it was in that period. So he was finally released because his time was done, and he went home and he lived with my parents for the rest of his, well, their life together, and he and mom are still together, the odd couple. They really are. It's hilarious, but I won't go into that because that's not about activism. But finally he was diagnosed properly and medicated properly, but not until he was in his 40s. So it's quite an amazing, that story itself is quite amazing. But the way my parents treated it and kept him in the family and kept him in the home really taught me about love and loyalty and sticking through things no matter what. I don't think I realized that until I started talking about it and really when I started writing about it and trying to pick out things about the early years of my life that probably had some influence on how, people say, how'd you get to be the way you are? How do I know? Sometimes in the early days after the prize when people would say, how did you get to be the way you are? And I would make up something on the spur of the moment because I thought it was such an irritating question. Now think about it. How did you get to be the way you are? It could be anything, right? I could name 10 things and they could all be wrong, for all I know. But I do believe my brother and trying to defend him when he was a kid, and Billy and Bobby, who lived next door to us in Pulteney, and we're a few years older than Steve and myself, were particularly horrific to him. They loved to torture him and make him afraid so they could hear the strange sounds of his fear. I don't know if any of you know the sounds of deaf who cannot hear. And one time I went after them, wanting to beat the crap out of them, quite frankly. That was before the Peace Prize. Now, I am no longer allowed to contemplate beating the crap out of people. Except maybe the NSA. I didn't catch them, and it's probably a good thing I didn't because they were like 11 and 12, and I was 6 or 7. And it was 2 boys again, the crap would have been beaten out of myself. But trying to defend my brother led me to try to defend other kids in grade school when people were mean to them. I don't think, did we call it bullying back then? I don't know. It was just mean kids. And the first time I did it outside of my brother was in 4th grade. And David was the stud of the 4th grade class at Green Street School in Brattleboro. You know Green Street. And Michael, the poor fellow, was the new geek who moved to town like a couple weeks into 4th grade. I mean, how horrible is that, even if he were a stud? But he was a horrific geek, poor thing, with ears that stuck out like this, very thick glasses that were crooked, you know, everything that, poor thing. And David was mean to him during recess. We were going to play kickball, and David kind of pushed him out of the circle and wouldn't let him play. And I stood there, and you know how when you're afraid, you know something's wrong, and you're afraid to try to do anything about it? And you're the mix of anger and fear, and you don't know which one is stronger. But at the same time, although it wasn't intellectually developed in 4th grade, somewhere in there was the feeling that if I didn't do anything, if none of us did anything, we were complicit. And in some ways, maybe we were even worse, because we were many, and David was one, and we all stood there doing nothing. So I worked it up and stepped in front of him and, you know, called him out on his nastiness, and he let Michael back into the game. He was not mean to Michael ever again. He was not mean to me. I quaked through the rest of the game. But it made, you know, it's all of those little incidents that set you on the road to thinking, you know, how different could the world be if people stood up and did the right thing when they know they should. And when, perhaps if one stands up, others will join. But the lemming effect of doing nothing is something that, on occasion, even now, I kind of can be a lemming. And I'm ashamed. If, you know, when it was right after 9/11, it was actually self-censorship a bit. Nobel's wrote a very strong series of articles about the response to 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan. And I don't know if you, of course you remember that period where the administration was very aggressive about anybody who stood up and said anything contrary. And I was writing some other article, I can't remember what, and I slightly changed a few words to seem less radical. And obviously that I'm remembering it now is an indication of my shame at myself that I did that. So I have never done it again, and, you know, come what may. In fact, after the Snowden business and the NSA revealed, I started giving a shout out to the NSA spies on Twitter and my Facebook page. I figured if they're spying, let's just say hello. Why not? My first, is that right? I think
specific words to get their attention?
our work, we deal with countries that are, you know, bad. We have, I should tell you about my husband, Steve Goose. We met actually banning landmines. Steve Goose is the director of the arms division, arms being weapons, at Human Rights Watch. We fell in love banning landmines. We got married. But he went on to ban other weapons. You know, I got the Peace Prize, and we got it in the international campaign to ban landmines. But even before the landmine ban, his arms division and the International Committee of the Red Cross managed to ban preemptively, meaning before they were produced, blinding laser weapons, 1995. And then after the landmine treaty, he and other NGOs went on to ban cluster bombs, 2008. He also got couple other protocols on weapons that I can't remember. Sorry, here. But we've worked very closely together, and I just want to acknowledge that. So I don't know where I was going when I broke up my weak train of thought.
On the kickball.
I finished the kickball.
Oh, bad countries.
Oh, bad countries of the NSA and saluting them. In our campaigns, you know, we work with activists from every country in the world. You know, so if you're sending an email to people in Kyrgyzstan or, you know, the Iranian friends we had before they went into exile, you know, you're going to get spied on. My first spy experience was actually in 1981. After I got that leaflet, I was working with the organization C-Space, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, and we were working with other groups to bring together a march on Washington in protest of the war. And so, you know, we were working, you know, day and night trying to plan it and make sure everybody had transportation to get there from all over the country. And people came and volunteered, and there was this guy who acted, this was in Washington, the office, acted like a good old boy, Southern boy. You know, didn't say much, just, I'll do whatever. And he stayed around for a few weeks as we were organizing, and then right as the time for the march itself came, he just sort of disappeared, and we figured he got bored. You know, he'd done his time as a volunteer, and he was bored. And we managed to get 80,000 people to come and march on Washington. And I think it was March of 1982, March 27th, if I remember correctly. So we're there, you know, walking around to make sure everybody's behaving. And you see this guy, and he's talking on a walkie-talkie. And so, you know, we kind of walk over closer to try to see who he's walkie-talkieing to. It's 3 uniformed cops. So we went up, you know, up to him and said, probably something like, "You're an effing asshole." You know, something very sweet. And he just laughed and walked away. So I've always felt since then, I've always felt spied on. Central America work was certainly unpopular. The landmine campaign at certain points became very unpopular with the United States. The government felt like we were actively trying to shame them. This was under Clinton, and it wasn't about shaming Bill Clinton or the American government. It was about trying to stop anti-personnel landmines in 80 countries around the world from killing and maiming people decades and decades and decades after the end of a war. How the, you know, exceptionalism of this country, it's at such an extreme that that's how they chose to interpret it, especially Mr. Clinton himself, that we embarrassed him personally. Now, he said that to me at a little event at the White House. I just looked at him and I wanted to be really nasty, but I just kept saying, I think, Mr. Clinton, this isn't an appropriate time for us to talk about this. We're in a reception of 500 people, and he's like yelling over the whole crowd, "You embarrassed me!" And I talked to Nelson Mandela, and Mandela said that you did that, and it was unbelievable. And so I kept saying, don't you think it'd be more appropriate if we made an appointment for a meeting and we sat down and discussed it? And every time I said that, you know, his voice would kind of go up a little more, and he'd say another bad thing about the landmine campaign. And then it just got ridiculous, so I said, "Thank you very much," and turned around to walk away. And as I'm walking away, he goes, "I'm with you guys, Jody." Well, my view, they're pretty much all like that. I try to, you know, think about Mr. Obama when he ran for office. Think about what Mr. Obama promised when he ran for office. Within, I think, 3 months of his taking office, he launched more drone attacks than Bush had done in his entire 8 years in office. So I don't believe much that politicians say. My first protest, as I started to say, was here at the University of Vermont against the war in Vietnam. It was May 1970, and Kent State had happened, and universities across the country were terrified that there'd be more violence, so they closed school down early. You know, we didn't even have to do final exams that year, which was awesome. And they just wanted us to go away so we wouldn't do anything. And then it was many years later, like many kids, I graduated from university with a lovely degree that was useless in the world. I got a degree in psychology. What can you do in Vermont with a bachelor's degree in psychology? I ended up being a surgical assistant to an oral surgeon. I did not need a university degree for that. And the first day on the job, I fainted 7 times. I didn't know that the mouth is one of the bloodiest parts of the body. And the poor dentist's light was out. So I was the light, I was a flashlight in the mouth. So every time I went down, I did a series of other less than stellar jobs. And every time I continued to do nothing of import, my mother and father would say, "You're so smart." I got a master's degree at School for International Training, and then I got one from Johns Hopkins, SAIS, and they kept saying, "You're a temporary secretary? What are you doing?" Then I got the Nobel Peace Prize and I got off my back. Seriously.
Whatever it takes.
Yeah, whatever it takes. But my road to understanding that I really wanted to be a full-time activist to try to stop the mythology of the benevolence of U.S. foreign policy. You know, it took trying this and trying that and trying this and that for 10 years. It wasn't until I was 30 years old and I got that pamphlet and I started volunteering, all fired up again, because I had been so ignorant that it didn't occur to me that after Vietnam and that, you know, complete chaos and stupid intervention and the deaths of so many, that the U.S. was still wandering around invading people. I was clueless. So when I get the brochure and it's Salvador and Vietnam and I read it, I'm like, embarrassed for myself. Embarrassed for myself that I was such an idiot that I didn't realize that this was going to keep happening in different forms. And I was really fortunate to be leafleted. I was fortunate enough to find people to work with who shared the same goals that I did. I was privileged through the 11 years that I worked trying to stop U.S. military intervention in Central America. It was primarily Salvador, a couple of years in Nicaragua and Honduras. To begin to learn the skills that would enable me to be effective with my other colleagues in building the landmine campaign. I worked in Salvador, as I said, for 11 years, and I was burned out, totally. We all know burnout, activist burnout in particular. And I consider, I'm sorry those who hear this so often, I always hate it when my friends are listening because he's heard this 8,000 times now. I told him tonight he should just stay home and read his book. Where was I again? Every time I look at you, I just get confused. Anyway, I was burned out and I actually contemplated a straight job. I went to Casual Corner. You guys don't know what that is. That's all women. It's where you went to get a suit if you wanted to try to, you know, look fancy and formal. I got a black suit, and I went to a career counselor, the ones you have to pay if they get you a job. And when I walked into that place, I was as freaked out looking at her as she was looking at me. And you know, sometimes it's just gut, and you know this isn't going anywhere. So we sat down with her, and right away I wanted to be mean. I hadn't won the Peace Prize yet. You know, the sainthood doesn't descend on you until you get the Peace Prize. I was still working my way toward it. So when she starts, let me take some notes, you know, about your career. So I started out, well, I know members of the Salvadoran Death Squad who were trained by the U.S. military to murder people. I've also translated for the counter-revolutionaries trying to overthrow the Sandinista government formed by our own lovely CIA. as you can imagine, as I continued, her eyes got like this. And finally, I mean, it became like shooting fish in a barrel. So I stopped, and she said to me, "Oh, I'm going to have to take this information and think about it for a while and try to see if I can find a way to mainstream it." Fortunately, I was saved from being mainstreamed by Bobby Muller, who was the director of the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation in Washington, and a colleague that I knew from work in Salvador named Tomas Gebauer from Medico International, who lured me to a meeting in order to try to get me to consider taking on the challenge of creating a campaign, a political movement of non-governmental organizations around the world to pressure governments to do what they should do anyway and ban anti-personnel landmines, which in our view were already illegal under existing international law. And since I failed in the straight job effort, and I was sick to death of Salvador and didn't want to talk about death squads or any of that anymore, I thought it was an incredibly challenging opportunity too. I was going to have to learn things that I hadn't done before. And I really believe that when we're excited and learning at the same time that we're being active, we can do some really outstanding work. So I started meeting with organizations, the first one being Human Rights Watch, because they were the first organization that had been systematically documenting the impact of landmines on civilians. You know, decades and years and decades after the end of war, making the legal case that these are not proportional weapons. It may benefit the soldiers for a battle or whatever, but does that mean that entire villages, entire countries live with landmines killing and maiming people for generations? They can last for 100 years, especially the plastic ones. Imagine that. And people thought that was okay. So I kept meeting with others and started going to Europe to meet with organizations that were working on arms control and disarmament, and it was so cool because I could say, my name is Jody Williams, and I am the coordinator of the international campaign to ban landmines. And we were two organizations, the Vietnam vets and the Germans. But I said it with deliberation, determination, and they believed me. And ultimately, we grew from that tiny, base of 2 with a staff of 1 to 1,300 NGOs in about 80 or 90 countries around the world. And in the space of 5 years, pushed governments to do what they should have done anyway, and they created the Mine Ban Treaty in 1997. The negotiations ended in Oslo, I think it was September 17th, and then 3 weeks later, the announcement from Oslo about the Nobel Peace Prize came out, that it was the international campaign to ban landmines and myself. And then a couple months later, we went to watch the countries come and sign that treaty. And the thing is, during negotiations, there were 88 countries who participated, thank God he's here, who participated in the actual negotiation. After we got the Peace Prize, we really believed that it even pushed what we had been doing into the public awareness more, and 122 nations came to Ottawa, Canada and signed that treaty, which is totally amazing. No, I don't know clapping, okay? Thank you. It was an outstanding feat for many reasons. We, for the first time in history, got a treaty passed that banned a conventional weapon that had been used by almost every single fighting force in the world for almost a century. Civil society, ordinary people like you and me, with a common goal and creativity and a plan of action, were able to push governments and militaries and the UN and the ICRC, who for the first time campaigned to ban a weapon. and they gave up anti-personnel landmines. And it was a rocking moment when the gavel came down in those negotiations and we had succeeded. It's pretty outstanding. And the other part of the landmine effort that I don't think most people think about, and we didn't, I don't think at first, was the impact that our success had on activists, on civil society. I got emails from people I had known in Central America work, you know, and calls and everything, and it was awesome. Like saying, you know, through you, we believe we got the Peace Prize too. You know, because you're us, because you're a grassroots activist, you know, and we work together. You know, thank you. And the thank you I don't like, because we all did it together. It's what I do. But we have done so much for the belief of NGOs and civil society that if they come together and work together and find governments who share the same goal, because, you know, we could press all we wanted, but treaties can only be negotiated by governments. So we also had to work and work and work to form partnerships with governments that shared our same goals. And that model, and bringing in the International Committee of the Red Cross and UN agencies, it was also that model that made the difference. And it also shifted thinking about arms control and disarmament from just getting rid of weapons to a new term, humanitarian disarmament. Meaning that you can't just think about the lovely marvel of the weapon itself. You have to think about the humanitarian impact of that weapon, which they don't like to do. They don't want to mess with, you know, that touchy-feely business. But we were able to accomplish that. And then a few years later, Goose and other organizations formed the Cluster Munition Coalition, and they were able to work with governments the same way and ban cluster bombs in 2008. And arms trade treaty, which was just negotiated, that wasn't so much our model, but our success helped them in the very long effort to finally get a treaty. And I think that's one of the things that I'm probably most proud of. The treaty itself, of course, but that we showed people that it does matter. You know, that every one of us does have a role to play. It's not just about our rights, our human rights. It's about our responsibilities to be part of creating a world that we want to be part of. I speak a lot to an organization called Peace Jam, which I totally adore. I think there are 12 of us Nobel Peace laureates that are part of it. And they created curricula about the work that received the Peace Prize. It's not a glorification of the individual. But students study that curricula for about 6 months, and then they get to spend a weekend with the laureate. And it's very fun. I've done a gajillion of them since '98. But the whole point is to help them understand that it's not magic, that they can have a part in it. I think people today think, you know, if I can't make it all beautiful by tomorrow, what's the point? If I can't bring world peace, you know, by clapping my hands, why bother? That's not how change happens. Change happens because people work together to shift the mindset. Because people have the courage and determination to get up off their comfortable chair and do something. And when I speak with those kids, you know, and sometimes they'll complain, you know, oh my God, global warming. And some of the adults there too. Oh my God, you know, LGBT. I get it wrong almost every time. I'm trying too hard. That, or, you know, I don't know, everything in the world that you can possibly be worried about. And my first question is, yeah, it's a challenge. What are you doing? And my response to them, and I'm very serious about it, if you care about a subject and you do nothing to change it, shut up. Shut up. Don't waste your energy and emotion if you're not going to be part of the answer. You know, just go and get a beer and watch soccer or football or baseball or read a book, or I'd be reading the book, I hate television. But, you know, complaining with your friends to feel better about yourself because you're more sophisticated than those who don't even care is not a strategy for change. Strategy for change is working with people who share your goals, and it's fun. You know, I think people think, oh my God, if you're an activist, how boring. You've got to be, oh, yeah. I like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, people. Not anymore. You know, we party, we have fun, I swear. We're all normal people. And yet, together, you know, we didn't give up any of our humanity. In fact, I think that we increased our humanity in ways that we didn't even imagine when we started out trying to change the world for the better. You know, when I got that little pamphlet and went to that meeting and signed up as a volunteer, who would have predicted that I would have gotten Mom and Dad off my back with the Nobel Peace Prize? It wasn't in the forefront of my mind, but it has given me a life that is just totally freaking awesome. And it's awesome because of the privilege I have to work with people around the world on all sorts of issues. Who get, I mean, I'm privileged. You know, we have a house in Westminster West, we have a house in Virginia. I wish we could sell that one and just move here, but that's not going to happen for a few years. You know, we have 2 cars. My husband is a wonderful fellow who buys me fabulous jewelry. And I think as an activist, you're not supposed to have things like that, but I don't care. I'm allowed to have a few, you know, things like that. I'm serious. You know, everybody's got their whatever. So I feel very privileged. And when people ask me about, you know, when you get tired, you know, who inspires you? How do you keep going? And I think they expect me to say people that I am very close friends with, Tutu or Shirin Ebadi or others of that ilk. That's not my answer. I love them. You know, they're cool. But the people who really, really, really make me want to get up and keep working are the women in the Democratic Republic of Congo, who are faced with the possibilities of rape or re-rape, or watching their children be raped, and yet get up every day and try to make a difference. Or, you know, I just did a Peace Jam. It was Peace Jam New England, and I think I'll close now. And if you want to ask questions, that's great. I'll close with the Peace Jam story because it really amazes me. It was at the University of Hartford. No, University of Connecticut at Hartford. And there were kids from, you know, different towns and boys and girls groups that came together. I think there were 300 of them for the weekend with me. And there were 7 or 9 kids who had come from Newtown, Sandy Hook. When they first got there, they kind of clung to each other, and they were a little nervous. And by the end of the 2.5 days, I mean, they were rocking with all the other young people who were there to learn about peace and to, you know, learn about how they could work together to bring about change. And at the end of every Peace Jam, there's a ceremony of inspiration. The name's a little touchy-feely for my taste, but you stand up and talk about your inspiration. And these kids got up there as a group because they needed, you know, each other. But stood there and said how they had been afraid to come because they felt like they were marked. You know, they felt like anywhere they went, the people would go, you know, oh, Newtown, where all those children were murdered. And they said that the experience made them realize that that wasn't the case. They were treated like everybody else at the Peace Jam, and it helped them begin to move beyond the fear of being marked for life. And there was one young guy in the group. I think there was 4 guys and 3 girls. I can't quite remember. And he stood there and started to talk, and he wept. And he said, "This is the first time I have cried." And he was with the volunteer fire department, so he was involved. And he said, "This is the first time I have cried since Newtown Massacre." And he said, "The reason I can stand here and finally cry is because I feel safe in a community who understands who I am and doesn't judge me because of what happened in my town." Those are the people who make me get up every day and try to work with others who share my feelings about a better world for everybody, even people I hate. Right? If you want the world to be better, you can't just say it's going to be better for my 10 friends. You want it to be better for everybody. Maybe even Newt Gingrich, you know. I know, that's rough. I know. Or W. Doesn't mean you have to invite them to dinner. Do you guys have questions? Anybody? You can ask me anything. Will you stand up and say your name?
Jody, thank you. A remarkable accomplishment by you and your organization. You mentioned drones. Have any activist organizations taken up this as a cause célèbre? I mean, they're really pushing for.
Yeah. There is. Yes, there is work on drones. It's not a particularly organized global campaign, although it is certainly increasing in attention and volume, especially since the hearings on Brennan. But recently, a handful of NGOs from the cluster munitions and the landmines created a new campaign to stop killer robots. And we launched it in London on the 23rd of April this year, which is kind of coincidental because it was almost exactly 20 years ago that we launched the mine campaign also in London. But the killer robot campaign is slightly different from drones, although it does get captured in our work. They are actually researching and trying to develop killer robots on the land, in the air, and under the water that on their own can kill you. If you think about how a drone functions, you know, it flies on its own for thousands of miles, but there is an operating team, let's say at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, and they're watching on a computer monitor with almost like joysticks, or whatever they're called, watching when the drone gets near a target. Okay, and in theory, at least in the beginning, they were supposed to make a face identification of a known terrorist, and then they would fire the missiles and kill them. Just want to tell you about the progression of that work. They are now allowed to do what is called signature strikes, and they are allowed to kill people based on behavior that might be that of a terrorist. Can you explain to me, unless you're watching the guy make the bomb, what is behavior that you see on a computer screen thousands of miles away from the people you do not know who they are that allows you the right to murder? At least there are human beings involved in that. The killer robots they are planning will have no human being in the kill decision. They are developing, and they have precursors now, they're developing robotic weapons that will have no human being involved in deciding to whack you. Once it's programmed and set free, it goes off on its mission. Think about Tahrir Square in the early days in Egypt when Mubarak was telling them to fire, you know, the soldiers and police to fire on the crowds, and some of them would not fire on other Egyptians. And in fact, they put their weapons in the air and joined them. A killer robot battalion would just fire. Already on the border between North and South Korea, on the South Korean side, on the Israeli side of Gaza, they have robotic sentry systems. At this point, there's still a man in the loop, as they say, but there is the capacity of those to be fully autonomous and decide, you know, how could they tell? What if a kid stumbles into the DMZ?
Oh, they kill them now.
They-
people.
Yeah, but the machine would, and I mean, there are others, but I won't go into that a lot, but. So we decided to create a campaign to go after killer robots, and part of it inevitably involves discussion with drones. I have to say, and I know this sounds sick, that I'm so excited about the campaign to stop killer robots. I really am. I think it's just, it is beyond the pale to me. It's crossing some moral and ethical Rubicon to think it is okay to create lethal robots that can sally forth and kill you. What does that say about the militarization and the mentality of the borderless battlefield of the war on terror? It's terrifying. When I first learned about the killer robots, I was writing an article about the CIA and the mercenaries they hire in the US military use of drones. Is when I came upon information about the R&D on the killer robots. And we cooked together. Well, he usually cooks more now than I do. We used to cook together. But I went into the kitchen and I said, oh, have you heard about killer robots? You know, and so we went through discussion about the difference between drones and killer robots, and, you know, after a while decided that we really had to get some of our allies together, have a meeting, and create a campaign, and we did. So we hope that it will also affect drones. Yes, stand up.
Hi, Megan. Thank you for the talk, Jody. My question is, I've worked in Cambodia on NGO networking, trying to bring NGOs together. The one thing I'd like to ask is, how do you sort of get NGOs to put aside their differences, or CSOs, things like that, and come together on those issues that really affect everybody? Because unfortunately, we're flawed people, and kind of cramming puzzle pieces together, I felt sometimes, is what I was doing on a daily basis.
No, I can only speak from my own experience. We were very fortunate in the landmine campaign in that nobody was working on it except like Human Rights Watch and the documentation, or the British NGO Mines Advisory Group, which were former British military who created an NGO to take mines out of the ground, or Handicap International out of France that had programs in, I think, 34 countries working on prosthetics, you know, for mine victims. But there was no real thought about coming together in a political movement to force governments to give these evil weapons up. And for me, really, the fact that there was nobody out there working on it is unfortunately a very important part of our progress. I think sometimes when you try to bring organizations together who have been working on an issue for a long, long, long time, the turf is so entrenched and ego that it's very difficult. And I'll give an example. About a year ago, the Nobel Women's Initiative, which I chair, there's 6 of us who received the Peace Prize, and a few years back we decided that we wanted to come together and use the influence and access that we have as women through the prize to support the work of women's organizations around the world working for sustainable peace with justice and equality. And we've done tons of things that go to our website if you're interested. But about a year ago, we launched a campaign to stop rape and gender violence in conflict. It has been more of a challenge to bring some of those, not all of them, but some of the groups together, because they've been working on, you know, women's issues or violence against women, or are very well known in and of themselves. So it's been quite a bit more of a challenge. Unlike the killer robots, you know, nobody was working on them. We decided we were going to create a campaign, and here we are. So I think it really depends on, you know, what are you trying to bring organizations together for? Is it a single goal, you know, one topic where they can come together to try to achieve an end while still doing their own independent work and protecting their own turf? So it varies depending on the situation. It's not always easy. You have to kind of be forceful. I was accused once of using a tactical nuke when I could have used a hand grenade. This was by Vietnam vets. No other person would have ever used that, frankly. But they were actually correct in assessing that I'd gone a little overboard in my heavy-handedness, pressuring some of the NGOs on the landmine issue. So it's not easy. Create something that nobody cares. Nobody and then you can just rock out with it. You take it over. Anybody else? All right. Thank you very much, people. Oh, did you want to ask something? You're mumbling there.
Did the U.S. sign either of those treaties?
No. Remember when I was talking earlier, I mentioned that Mr. Clinton's point of view was that we, in fact, embarrassed him in the world. That wasn't really the issue. The military pounded on him when he actually came very close to deciding to join the Mind Ban movement. The Saints, the regional commanders, came together and had a meeting, and a couple of them went ballistic about giving up anti-personnel landmines, and they forced him.
What about the other one?
Oh God, no. But the one good thing, at least in terms of the Mind Ban Treaty, even though the U.S. has not signed, we have not used the weapons since the first Gulf War, 1991. We have not exported since Senator Patrick Leahy's first legislation to stop the export of anti-personnel landmines in 1992. We haven't produced since the mid-90s. We've destroyed millions in our stockpile. And are we the biggest funder still? And the U.S. is the biggest donor for mine clearance and victim assistance in the world. So it's like, here's a treaty, guys, that you're actually obeying. Why not join it and look like you actually might have a little bit of interest in multilateralism? But I had recently, not totally recently, a while back I ran into a bunch of cadets, West Point, maybe, I can't remember, one of the military schools. And he came up to me, I was giving a talk about CIA and drones, and he came up to me and said, you know, we kind of study what you guys have done. I said, and did they tell you you're never going to sign the U.S. is never going to sign the treaty? And he got really uncomfortable, and then he said, yeah. Well, in my view, it's because the U.S. military does not want to be constrained by any treaties. In fact, when Leahy introduced legislation to stop the use of landmines, which was really symbolic because we weren't using them, the U.S. military sent him a letter and said that if he persisted in this path and banned this weapon, it would put other weapons available to the U.S. military at risk due to humanitarian concerns.
Oh, that's so.
So they don't want to be constrained. I mean, the U.S. is very happy if other countries sign treaties and they're constrained, because it then gives them more leeway. It's a very F-you mentality.
Jody, did the Russians sign?
No, Russia didn't sign either. But you know, those the so-called big powers, Russia and China both stopped producing for export when 95, maybe. They stopped producing altogether, both of them. I stand corrected. Both of those big powers no longer produce at all. And China was cooperating with training on mine action and gave some money. So the fact that 161 countries in the world are part of the treaty, and that you know, it has tremendous implementation and compliance. The number of new mine victims every year has dropped from 20,000 to 4,000. still 4,000 too many, but it's a huge drop. Large areas of land have been cleared. It's a huge stigmatization of the weapon. So if one of those powers were to use it, it wouldn't look, you know, it would cause them trouble. So that shows what the power of bringing other countries together, even if the big guys don't want to be part of it, that you can force them to obey, even if they won't.
Took away their markets.
Huh?
You took away their markets.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, landmines are chump change. A couple $100 million, I don't know, it's like nothing in the gajillion-dollar industry of weapons. One of the big challenges we'll have with killer robots is it's billions of dollars in contracts. Well, it's not that many jobs though. But in the universities, the DOD is giving research money to, you know, in the science departments on this stuff. You know, it reminds me of napalm and, was it the University of Chicago? No, napalm back in Vietnam. Wasn't it Chicago?
Yeah.
Anyway, it was one university that was involved in the development and whatever of napalm, and people went after them. And so universities for a while didn't get involved with DOD, but now it's right back up there.
Do you think that's why they're pushing STEM in the science, technology, engineering, and math? Partly throughout the lower grade schools now?
I think it's more for, you know, economic issues, because technology is where we're going, you know. Yeah.
Have any new landmines been laid down in current or recent wars?
In recent
Why don't you
years,
stand up so people can
we've
hear?
usually been in a place where in recent years
Close, they
only
can't hear you
the
in
worst
back.
governments would use them. And for
The
about
US
5 years
as well.
running, only Burma was
Do you guys hear 'em in the back?
Yeah. But Libya, Gaddafi's forces laid them 2 years ago, and the last 2 years, Syria's government forces have also used them. But it's just essentially the worst of the worst who are willing to use them. It's only usually 1 or 2 governments a year. That's how bad it's been stigmatized.
It's really a
Do
great
they have
problem.
Made in USA label on them?
No, only old mines.
Yeah, Burma's mines are copies of U.S. mines.
Yeah.
Who's making them now?
What are the countries that make them today? I don't know.
Well, we list about 12 governments who used to produce, who haven't yet joined the Ban Treaty, but of those, really only 2 or 3 are actively producing. India and Pakistan and Burma. And India and Pakistan produce higher tech mines that they want to use against each other.
Every time they almost go to war, of course, over border area. Anything else? Thank you, people.